Okay, hello guys. Today I'm here to discuss in depth about the Oldhim deck list I brought into the double ProQuest and managed to win two of those. So, if you just want to hear about my experience with the ProQuest, there will be a link below with the discussion I had with Hamish from Push the Point if you just want that. Here I will just go in depth into every single matchup and about how to sideboard with this deck. You can also find below the finals I had versus Lexi on one of the ProQuests. And you can see on the bar if you want a specific sideboard guide for any specific matchup, you can also find that below. So, with all that out of the way, let's start. So, general thoughts about the deck. First of all, Oldhim, it didn't appear for me to be as strong in the beginning of the ProQuest season and when I started testing, but the results were pretty huge that Oldhim is actually probably the deck to play right now. It has a good fight matchup and a decent matchup into Yslander. So I want to just quickly talk about some of the cards, and after that we will discuss about every single card choice about any specific matchup. So I wanted to run Oakenold because I feel it's the way you need this card in order to win some games. You need to be able to high roll a bit, and the rest of the deck is, basically this Fi and the aggressive sideboard and the slower sideboard, and just some Stone's responses for the Guardian matchups. So everything else is probably pretty normal Oldhim stuff. We will discuss a bit more about the specific card choices again on the specific matchups. So I want to leave Fi as the last deck, so I will leave Fi as the last deck, so because I played against many Fis over the past weekend, so I have a lot of things I want to talk about, so we will just leave Fi as the last deck. So against Katsu, you pretty much give him the exactly Fi approach. You just want the 3 crash the weeks and your deck goes up to 60. Most of the time you never want to go above 60 because you never are actually in fear of getting fatigued, just because of how efficient your deck can go if the game goes this long. Some things to note when playing against ninjas in general. I think the hardest thing to do when faced off against aggressive decks is when to use the Fiendal Spring Tunic, and that's probably one thing that separates the good Oldhim players from the great Oldhim players. And I think most of the deck is pretty straightforward. You want to get as much value as you can from your blocks, and after that be as efficient as possible with presenting an attack that needs to be blocked. So what you want to do against Katsu, which is pretty similar what you want to do against Fi, you block with most of your cards and then you love to open with Crash the Week, or you use Tunic and attack with Debilitate, or you play a CNC or play an Endless Winter. The great thing about this deck is that whenever your opponent will give you more cards that you can actually use aggressive, you most likely will have a way to use them. What I mean is, if the Katsu gets a 3-card hand and they just give like E-Strike for 7 and they keep the last card in hand, you can actually stay and calculate what do you prefer to do. Do you have a nice card, so you want to strip their arsenal, or do you prefer to actually play an aggressive Winter's Bite and be more aggressive, or you have a 3-cost attack and a tier Asunder and you're just fine, just bloating with 1 card, taking the 4, because after that you can crash the week with tier Asunder for 7. And that's probably why tier Asunder actually makes the cut. It was a card that I originally did not have in my list. The tier Asunder card. It felt a bit too slow for Oldhim, but having a blue card that blocks for 3 that can sit on Arsenal and you're pretty fine with it, and whenever you get more cards that you can actually use to just play the tier Asunder to pump up any attack, it's a pretty great line. So Against Katsu, it's really important to consider when you want to use the stalagmite. It's probably one of the hardest decisions, but because his deck is pretty much straightforward, it's pretty easy to see when they actually want to go off or where you can actually prevent an attack with stalagmite. So it shouldn't be too hard of a matchup to play off against Katsu. So without further ado, let's move on to Dorinthia. Okay, Dorinthia right now is a bit of a tricky one because a lot of Dorinthia players will get the approach of trying to fatigue you, while other Dorinthia players will just try to rush you out. I think it's one of the few examples where you don't actually mind going a bit over 60. Against Dorinthia, you do like the Rampart to just always have the option if the game goes slower to actually be able to fatigue them, because with Crown of Seeds, Sealed and the Earth React, you can pretty much neutral block their Dawnblade attack while you're still attacking with Winter's Wail. So on the super long game, if they are not super ahead on the fatigue matchup, they can never win. And actually that's the case with a lot of the aggressive decks. So against Dorinthia, it's one of the few matchups that Stone's Response are actually good, and you can just bring an extra copy of Glacial Footsteps. Now, if you are 100% that their approach might be they want to fatigue you, you can increase the Glacial Footsteps up to 3 and go up to 62. And that's to just have 2 additional cards to block, because actually it's one of the few matchups where you can actually set up the Oakenhold. And that's pretty relevant. Okay, now Polar Blast, it's a great card because if you are not using the Crown of Seeds defensively, Polar Blast a lot of times against these decks that try to defend against you a lot, it's actually really strong because it's almost like a Winter's Bite that draws a card. And that's huge during the later stages of the game, because what happens with Dorinthia a lot is that at some point you want her to no longer be able to give easy go again to the Dawnblade, and it's pretty easy for you to blow up one of their turns, because you can, let's say they attack for Dawnblade with 4/3 and you go Rampart and you go just Crown of Seeds, Pizza Blue, and just Crown of Seeds, and you block 1 and you Earth React for 3, and suddenly they give it an additional 3 and go again, and you have a D-React, and suddenly you block their attack. Or another great line is you have Stone's Response in Arsenal and they do +2 go again on the sword, and you Pizza Blue, you block with a shield, and after that you play a Stone's Response and you effectively block for 8, potentially up to 10 with the Earth React of Oldhim, and you have not triggered Reprise. And that's something that Dorinthia struggles a bit. The thing to be really worried of is that if the Dorinthia gets the slow approach, you need defense reactions on the second cycle. So my tip for this matchup is that if you see your opponent not ever committing and even keeping 3 cards in hand and do like Pizza Blue attack with sword, you block with 1 card and they're like, okay, Arsenal the last card, and they just get the really slow approach. Or if you see that they actually pitch their good cards like the Steelblade Supremacy and stuff like that, you actually want to Crown of Seeds some defense reactions or even pitch them, because most likely if that's the case, you will not need the extra reactions most of the time to block their attacks if they get the super slow approach. And you really love to have some defense reactions on the second cycle where after they filtered their deck, they want to start pressing damage, they want to start the pressure up. And that's where you actually need the defense reaction. So it's a pretty tricky matchup, but I actually think if you do not get blown out by something, if you do not lose the shield to a Satyr or something along those lines, I think because they lose the super late game, it's a matchup that you can handle pretty easily. But it's a pretty hard matchup, to be honest. Okay, let's move on from Dorinthia into Boltyn. Okay, Boltyn has actually seen some success, both the Raiden Boltyn and the combo Boltyn, because it plays well into some other matchups. In You most likely will not know if your Boltyn opponent is on the OTK plan or if he's running Raiden. If he's running Raiden and playing a more grinded list, you just need to be careful, but you're fine. So what you actually want to do, you prefer to play around the fact that they might run the combo list. So what you actually want to do is you want to run the 2 copies of Expose of the Elements. It's actually one of the few matchups that Expose of the Elements is actually playable and actually good. And about the last card, you can just add a copy of Crash the Week, but just in order to not have too many cards that actually make you not be able to block, you can even cut the copy of Blizzard. Now, that really depends on what... If you have knowledge about your opponent's deck, if you know your opponent is playing the OTK deck, you want all of these cards. You want the 2 copies of Exposed and you want the Blizzard, because it actually prevents them from going off. If you are in the blind and they might be running the more mid-range deck, I think you can still just cut a copy of Crash the Week, run a bit more blues in your deck list, but you can manage. So run the 2 Exposed, run a single Crash the Week and Blizzard. And you really want, if they run the mid-range deck, you just want to be efficient with your blocks, and his deck can never, outpace you during the later stages of the game. Command and Conquer into Tunic Pummel is great against them, Endless Winter is okay against them, Spinal Crush is great against them. So you really want to take this game slower if they're actually on the mid-range Boltyn. If they are on the full aggressive Boltyn list with the OTK game plan, I think if you just at some point pop a piece of equipment, that's pretty much game. Yeah, and I also think you should be running Stalagmite, not... you should be running Stalagmite, not the Rampart Shield. So, that's pretty much it with Boltyn. It shouldn't be too hard of a matchup because of just how well Ice interacts with decks that do not have a super high Ice count. So it should be a matchup that you should be okay. Okay, after that we move on to Kano. Okay, Kano is actually a bit tricky matchup because it's actually one of those matchups that you can actually lose. And it's one of the few matchups probably that you miss not having the hammer, and you miss a bit not having the Heart of Ice. But it shouldn't be too much of a too big of a deal. Not having the Oasis is also a bit problematic. You can actually lose, but if you play a somewhat aggressive deck with a high blue count, you should be fine. You want to cut all the defense reactions against the Kano. You want as many blues as you can fit in. Blues are great into Kano. You don't really care about the debilitate, so you can cut them off. And on the 6 remaining slots you have, you can just add all the big attacks to be able to threaten them for the biggest attack possible every single turn. And the game plan is pretty much straightforward. You try not to die in a weird OTK turn. And it's pretty easy for Oldhim to do that. During the later stages of the game, you want to keep a card in arsenal, so the moment they will try to go off with their opening combo card, the Wildfire card, yeah, having the extra point of blocking with Crown of Seeds is huge. It's super relevant. And because actually you are one of the few decks that can actually prevent 4 points of arcane damage from that card, the reach they get is actually way lower than the normal reach. They though have way more time, because just attacking for 10 most of the time doesn't mean anything to them. But if you combine Command and Conquers and Pummels on a great timing, you might force them into a position where if they keep blocking at some point they die. If they go off, there is no way they can kill you. So it's a pretty hard matchup, but again a pretty navigatable one. Okay, now Boogeyman number 1 of the format for Oldhim. Okay, against Yslander, I will be honest, you are definitely not in favored to win the matchup, you are definitely behind. What you need to do, we actually need to cheat and steal some points of value out of their deck and make a hard meta call into how they're going to approach the matchup in order to win. And what do I mean by that is that, okay, we definitely don't want the Command and Conquers. You want, just like Kano, all the big attacks and the Thunderquakes. You love the Debilitates because they are actually relevant. But what you also want to do is that you want some copies of defense reactions. And in order to do that, probably the best thing to do is, if you go first, if you do get the first turn, you can cut a Blizzard. Right. If you go second, you want to actually cut a Spinal Crush, because Debilitate has a bit better numbers in comparison to Spinal Crush, because by pitching 2 blues sometimes you can actually even play around with Pummel and stuff. It's one of the few plays you can do with a single card, and the Debilitate hit effect is actually relevant into Yslander. They cannot, it's not, most of the time they cannot just say take 8 and give them, because the -2 actually matters, while Spinal Crush, it only matters if they have something like Scar for Scar with Go Again, but we don't really care about these turns because we actually do not run the Lantern, we run the Stalagmite. And it's actually super relevant. Not the Frostbite is not that relevant, it's just a nice addition that we run the Stalagmite into the matchup, but the 3 points of life it gives you, it pretty much keeps them on the same spot that they do not. Most of the time what happens with Yslander, if you do not run the Stalagmite, is that you almost never want to use the 3AB against almost very specific cards, but you most of the time wouldn't care to block 3 Arcane either way. So, and Stalagmite gives you the 3 HP to counter the fact that they as well have armor, because they get about either 4 or 5 points of armor out of their equipment, and you get 0. You only get to block with Fiendal Spring Tunic at some point during the game. That will probably not matter, while Stalagmite straight up gives you 3 points of life. The problem with this approach is that you need to be 100% sure that they are running the aggressive attacks list. It's not a huge deal if they are not, because to be honest, I think at the moment the aggressive list with the attacks, it's way better. And because you actually have the Crown of Seeds, even if you arsenal a red defense reaction, and I mean you go first, you pass your turn, you're like, okay, I'm going to sink below the arsenal to get a blue in hand and that, and let's say they even called you out, they actually figure out that you have a defense reaction in arsenal, or they see later in the game that you put a defense reaction in arsenal. Crown of Seeds, the best card in the game. It can always help you cycle through your bad cards. And the amazing thing versus Yslander is that you actually want, whenever you have the option of whenever they do not have an arsenal, and that's something that you actively want to happen, to get a turn with them without having an arsenal card, so you can set up a bit of more aggressive turns, you can set up a Tira Sander turn, you can actually use the Tunic counter a bit more easier to play, a bit more efficient, endless Winter Fuse with just 3 cards and stuff like that. That's how you get the few points with Yslander. So there are 2 key cards on the matchup. One card that's pretty key, it's how you actually use the pummels. It's super relevant to strip the last card out of their hand. It's super relevant because you want to break the cycle of tempo they get each turn. That's what you actively need to do, and that's the same reason we use Exposed to the Elements, and that's probably the biggest reason why we love the Oakenolds. Because the moment, if you want to set up Oakenold a bit, having Oakenold sitting in Arsenal for some turns, it's fine, because the moment you play it, you actually will force them to play their hand into your 2 blues hand. And that's great, because after that most likely you will have resetted their arsenal. You will have kicked the card in arsenal if they want to keep doing stuff, and that's pretty huge. And after that, it's way easier to do things like play a Polar Blast, play a Winter's Bite, set up a Tier Yslander, and all that stuff that we already discussed. And how you actually want to use Exposed to the Elements is that after you do, let's say you do a big attack turn, you play Thunderquake, you attack for 10, right? And they just go play Amulet of Ice from Arsenal, and they block with 3 cards, and they keep the last card in hand in order to put in Arsenal. That's the moment you want to Ice Fuse the Exposed to the Elements. You don't really care about the Earth part so much, you mostly care about the Ice, and you actually want to force them to make the decision if they want to keep their boots or they keep their cards in Arsenal. And that's a win-win situation, because you actually manage to prevent them from doing the same cycle over and over again. So even though it's a bit tougher matchup, because we do a hard meta call on how they will approach the matchup, we actually do have the edge on the matchup, in my opinion, versus the more traditional Yslander builds that run around right now. Okay, let's move on into the mirror. Okay, Exposure of the Elements is one of the other cards that actually is in the mirror, because like most lists, most Oldhim lists, they no longer run the big hammer. And actually that's pretty reasonable of how the Oldhim decks have developed, and you actually love to have the Exposure of the Elements, because if you actually manage to either dual fuse, and Oldhim you will never actually destroy Crown of Seeds unless you are super ahead. There is almost no way for you to, manage and destroy Crown of Seeds with Ice. What you do care about the Exposure of the Elements, though, is give the -1 armor counter to the Rampart's Ram's Head, because suddenly their turn becomes super inefficient. They just need to pitch a card to prevent 1 point of damage with Crown of Seeds. And actually, if that happens and they do not run Exposed to the Elements to do the same to your shield, there is no way for you to lose the game. No way, almost, unless you get super high rolled or something and they run the super aggressive list or something really weird happens. So how you actually want to sideboard, it's again one of the few matchups that you do not mind going a bit over 60, and again because there are sometimes that you do not want to have many cards that do not block, you want to actually cut the Blizzard and you put the Spinal Crush in. So you just go up to 63, you want all the defense reactions in, and you bring all the big attacks and add the Exposed to the Elements. So it's a great matchup to use also Oakenol, because it can go to the second cycle, you have your big attacks and it goes, the tempo game. But the second you actually manage to Earth Fuse Exposed to the Elements, you get insanely ahead. If they run the Rampart. If they do not run the Rampart, that's a bit harder, a bit trickier, you might actually get fatigued, but you just play a very grindy, slow block defensive game over Crown of Seeds and Rampart. Okay, let's actually now, and also, and you definitely want the Stone's Responses. Stone's Responses, you shouldn't, probably Bravo is the next deck, so Stone's Responses aren't as important versus Oldhim as they are with Bravo. So you use them a bit early, they are fine, they are not that important. Just make sure to figure out if they run Oakenol or not. If they do not run if they do run Oakenol, you actually want the Stone's Responses on the second cycle when you have counted that they are actually going to play their Oakenols. If they do not run Oakenol, just don't care. Just play Stone's Response for tempo, get the value out of it, get the 2 for 7, get the 2 cards, 8 block off a blue Rampart and Stone's Response, and get done with it. You don't really care to get the full value out of the Stone's Response. So, that's pretty much it. Let's move on into Bravo. Okay. Against Bravo, it's pretty much the same approach, but we don't want the Exposed to the Elements. We just go back to run the single copy of Blizzard, and you can you can just run the 61, but against Bravo as well, you do like the Command and Conquer. So the deck now gets a bit clunky because most of the time you will block a bit more against Bravo. You are fine cutting a few copies of the aggressive cards. Now that really depends. If you go first, you actually want to have all the copies of Thunderquake. Otherwise, you prefer to have the copies of Glacial Footsteps. So it's a bit too greedy to add the full 6 cards to go up to 65 because we add 0 blues to our list, and that's pretty greedy from our side. So I would probably just cut 2 of them and go with a 63. 63, it's a bit more fine, and it's one of those matchups that it's actually relevant to have a bit more cards in our deck, because if their approach is just run the full 70 card deck against us and Remembrance and stuff, having a few extra cards might actually prevent us from getting fatigued. If the game goes super long and we trade evenly, Oldhim cannot get fatigued, but if they trade even unevenly and they have 10 more cards in their deck and they actually manage to play 3 copies of Crippling Crush and Remembrance and play 5 copies of Crippling Crush, we might get to a spot where we would fatigue them, but we actually run out of cards. And that's pretty annoying. That's a bit of insurance to have against specifically the Bravo. And against Bravo, you almost never want to play a defense reaction from hand. You pretty much always want to have a defense reaction in Arsenal because it's pretty much their only out. You can, against Bravo, you can get the game super late. You don't really care you don't want to finish the game too fast. You're fine with the game going late because during the later stages of the game, your deck is cleanly stronger. Your deck is just a stronger deck in the late game if you do not get devastated by their big attacks. Okay, that's pretty much it with Bravo. And again, it's a great second cycle game that you can set up Pokemon, and that's pretty relevant. Also, never forget how important Spinal Crush is into Bravo, because if they completely ignore the effect, they cannot activate Bravo and they cannot do big turns. So that's actually, Spinal Crush is one of those cards that would naturally get the cut into the matchup, but we actually love the Spinal Crush because they cannot do these many multi-action turns. Okay, let's move on to Rhinar. Okay, brutes in general, I know it might sound silly, are a bit of a hard matchup. You definitely want the Stalagmite against the brutes, definitely against Rhinar, because you do not expect to block too much, and we unfortunately cannot afford to run the copies of Stone's Response. So against Rhinar, it's pretty straightforward. You want to be the aggressor. You want to be the aggressor, and you actually need to kill them. Blocking too much against Rhinar is not realistic. And what you want the game to go to this stage where each turn both of you block with 2 cards and attack with 2 cards. That's probably your dream, how you want the game to get on this stage, because that's actually your game plan. And apart from cards like Swing Big, they don't have many ways of outvaluing you in that pace of the game. So you need Stalagmite in order to prevent an extra attack on their big turns. The 0-cost defense reactions, you could say that, yeah, if my whole hand is getting intimidated, I can no longer play the defense reaction. That's true, but most of the time, if they wanted to have a full hand in order to intimidate your full hand away, they probably took your attack. You don't want to keep Arsenal too much against them, and after that you can use your 3 cards to attack and Arsenal the defense reaction. And I think that's probably one of the most important things versus Rhinar. Arsenal, the first opportunity you get against Rhinar, Arsenal the defense reaction, because a lot of cards they run actually get blanked if they get blocked by 2 cards. The Wild Rides, the Pulping and stuff like that actually lose the go again if they are blocked with 2 cards. So if they try to do a huge turn and stuff like that, and they intimidate 3 cards out of your hand, or they attack with Pulping Dominate, and you actually defense reaction and block with card from hand, and suddenly you fully stop their 4 card turn, or their, you know, their 16 damage turn or something, it's actually a deal breaker. It's actually how you win this matchup. Okay, you want the bigger attacks in order to, if they intimidate you a lot, you want to be able to swing back and be as aggressive as possible to force them on the lower HP. You should always keep in mind the reaction, but you can actually play around it with Crown of Seeds if they do have the reaction that deals you 2 damage. So apart from that, it should be pretty straightforward because you have a lot of great cards, but you can actually lose if they high roll you a bit. So now let's move on to Levia. Okay, Levia, I will first discuss about the sideboard. Against Levia, you want the Stone's responses and that's it. You're fine going a bit over to 62 because again, you might get fatigued by Levia, even though that might sound silly. You might get fatigued by Levia, that's why you need the extra more 3 block cards, and actually defense reactions are great against Levia because most of the times it doesn't have many ways to intimidate. Again, you need the Stalagmite in order to try and prevent one of their turn. What you want to happen with Levia is that you want to force her in a position where she cannot attack too much and she actually needs to block your cards. The problem is that if you allow Levia to play with 4 cards every turn, she will never take damage to Blood Debt, and that's probably the lose condition for you. I mean, if they never take damage from Blood Debt and they attack you with 2 cards every single turn, at some point you will just lose. So you actually really need to be the aggressor to force them into blocking a bit, so they do not do such strong turns, and during the final turns of the game, to actually maybe block them out a bit and let them bleed out. It's not easy. It's actually one of the few matches I lost in the ProQuest versus a Levia, but if Levia misses a turn and you manage to get some tempo, it's a matchup that's hard but not unbeatable. It's not the problem is that Levia plays great into the block with 1 card, attack with 3, and that's a lot of times your game plan, and that's why you do not enjoy playing into Levia too much. And it's not easy to call out their attacks because it's not easy to calculate their attacks with Stalagmite, and it's not easy to calculate their attacks with Ice React, because if you just block with 2 cards and Ice React to skip their turn, and then you just attack with Hammer, they can just take 4 and have a 4 card turn, and after that you cannot do that again. It's not Fi, where the Ice React, you know exactly what's going to happen when the Ice React with Levia, and that's a bit of a problem. So anyway, let's move on from Levia into Briar. Okay, so Rune Blades are still really legit. Against Rune Blades, you just want the 1 points in Arcane in the boots. I don't really like the Rampart, and I love the Stalagmite because it's sometimes easy to figure out what they want to do and how to use the Stalagmite. You really don't care about the bigger attacks against Rune Blades, and you just can add the Crush the Weeks. So Crush the Week is not super relevant, it's just fine that it's a 3 for 7, which is pretty much the value that you're expected to attack most of the time, and it actually just prevents Belittle into Briar. What you want to do is you actually need to prevent their Channel Mount Heroic turn, yeah. Who would figure? Okay, if you actually manage to disrupt their big turns and you just play the game of attack with 2 cards, block with 2 cards, attack with 2 cards, block with 2 cards, take some damage, attack with 3 cards, now they need to block more and stuff like that, Briar, it's almost impossible to fight you on that game state because a lot of times her cards are not as valuable as you, and the CNC Pummel really hurt them, and the Spinal Crush Pummel really hurt them, and you know, Debilitate again is relevant, and Crush the Weak might be relevant because they cannot play Gloomveil, they cannot play, so it's pretty much exactly the Fi approach, and you just need to be a bit wary of the Channel Mount Heroic turns. It's one of those matchups where you don't really crown a lot. you do not actually use Crown of Seeds a lot in the Briar matchup unless you do have the extra card and the extra resources. So you can actually keep a Spinal Crush or a Blizzard or, you know, even Lake or a big disruptive card in Arsenal until they play the Channel Mount Heroic. But don't get the too slow approach. If you have no attack and you have the decision of taking 3 and play the Spinal Crush from Arsenal, or take nothing and just attack with Hammer, most of the time it's better to keep attacking. So don't consider it too much. Don't play too defensively, because you actually want to reduce their life totals, because Briars, like most Rune Blades and like most of the aggressive deck, really don't like blocking. Okay, so I just figured, yeah, we will discuss this about later. Okay, so Viscera, it's pretty much the exact same approach and the exact same sideboard. Versus Viscera, the matchup is a bit tricky. If they never do a huge turn, you actually win the game. It's not easy for them to fight you straight on the 3-card attack, 1-card block every turn. It's not easy for them to fight you, because the moment you want to disrupt them, it's pretty great. Okay, Stalagmite, the more experienced Viscera players, most likely if they do, they will have Tunic, and they will just keep the Tunic on 3 counters forever and never use the Fiendl's Pink Tunic counter in order to play around Stalagmite. And you are fine with that trade up to the point where you can actually block with Stalagmite to force them to use Tunic. So you know that the next turn, if they want to attack, you can use the Stalagmite again and be 100% sure that you will actually prevent something. And you actually get a 2-turn window to do that before the Tunic goes up to 3 again. So if you are trying to set up 3 back-to-back big attack turns and you know that you don't want to block, it's a great opportunity to just use Stalagmite to force them to use the Tunic, and actually use Stalagmite again to actually prevent the attack with Rosetta. The same a bit goes with Winter's Bite, because even if it's one of the few matchups where actually Winter's Biting, while they do have the Tunic, even though it's a card for virtually nothing, if they get a turn that they want to attack and finish their turn with Rosetta and they do not have the 3rd counter in Tunic, Stalagmite suddenly becomes super relevant. So with all that in mind, if you keep the pressure up and try to disrupt their huge turns and you don't get Mordred Tide, Gloomveil, Revel, Rosetta, I think you're pretty fine. You can actually win the matchup. It hurts a bit not running the Chokeslams. The Chokeslams are a bit better from the debilitates, because Viscera traditionally likes to block a lot and they don't really care about debilitate, but still, it's fine. Debilitate is still an amazing card. So, let's move on with Dash. Okay, versus Dash, you want to get the as aggressive approach as possible. You definitely want the Rampart. When I see Dash, I consider that they want to set up the pistols, so we just need all the big attacks and we want none of the defense reactions to just not choke ourselves up. I actually played against a ProQuest against a guy that was running the Mechanoid Dash, and because I knew that, I added the 2 copies of Expose of the Elements and cutted a Blizzard and another card that I feel is not super relevant. I just cutted a copy of Debilitate. So I added the Exposed with the Elements because I knew they were running the Mechanoid. If Mechanoid becomes the meta deck of Dash, you can keep that, but in the blind, if I have 0 information, I guess I would go with Debilitate and Blizzardine and approach the matchup as I know they have pistols. It's not a big of a deal though, it's not like you lose too much stuff, you just add a single blue and lose one of the worst attacks in your deck. So you can just be safe and run Exposed with the Elements to play around the Mechanoid, because actually the Mechanoid matchup is pretty hard if your opponent is running that. and you do not run the exposed to the elements. But again, against more traditional decks, you want to keep the pressure up as much as possible. The Glacial Footsteps dominate. It's actually one of the few matchups that it's actually super relevant to have, and you want to keep the pressure up, and by the time they have their pistols, you want to be able to disrupt them with either Spinal Crush or Endless Winter, because both of these cards are a hard stop for their turn, and so is Channel Lake Frigid. So if you have the option of putting on the bottom of your deck a Command and Conquer or an Endless Winter, you can play one of those attacks, and you need to either block with the other or arsenal it. Keep the Endless Winters for later in the game, because it's actually one of the few cards that you need to close the game, because Oldhim doesn't have a lot of ways to dominate, and Endless Winter forces them to skip a turn, because if the Endless Winter hits, even if they take 1 point of damage, they can no longer use the pistols effectively. Alright, so it's probably one of the hardest matchups. I think it's the Pistol Dash. If the Pistol Dash is pretty much prepared to play into you, it's probably one of the hardest matchups. You need to high roll in order to kill them, but you do have the tools to high roll, and that's again where Oakenold shines. So let's move on into Dromai. Okay, now Dromai again is a bit tricky of a deck, because it's actually one of the deck that plays into your weaknesses, that they actually have a stronger late game plan than you. Against Dromai, I would recommend running the 1 copy of Arcane Barrier, and you need all the poppers your deck have, and you want the Blizzard, and bear with me, you actually want the 0 cost defense reactions. So why is that? You actually want to go to 68 because most likely your deck is pretty much consistent. You make Oakenolds way worse. You make it get the option of getting the Pummel way lower early in the game if you go up to 68, but you know the game will go long. You need the exposed to the elements in case they run their gloves. So you actually want to have the exposure of the elements in order to get rid of that. Most of the Dromai's decks nowadays do not run that. So to be honest, I would probably even just run a single copy of exposed to the elements. I don't want too many cards that actually do not block again. And you want the game to go low. If you manage to high roll them enough from the beginning, you can pretty much try and get the Bravo aggressive approach and just attack face each turn and pop a dragon. The problem is that if they open with cards like Mirage and Dromai and the Passing Mirage, there is nothing you can do. You need to lose a turn to destroy these cards. So if you get too far behind on tempo, actually your approach is trying to fatigue them. And the more experienced Dromai players will start attacking either with Ignoring Phantasm, or they will start attacking with random attacks to bait your blocks, to actually bait your poppers. That's why you need the 0 cost defense reactions. Because it's the silly point of, they know we have 6 power attacks, so we know that we want to pop their attacks to get a turn, so they play around that by attacking with non-phantasm cards, and we actually call them out by running the 0 cost defense reactions to actually manage to block this card without wasting a popper. Because the problem is that if you overuse the poppers and overblock with the poppers, you actually just run out of them. I mean, most Dromai decks right now, if they have the billion popper, the billion dragons, you will run out. And if you run out, that's a huge problem if at some stage of the game you can no longer steal a turn by popping a dragon. Pretty hard matchup. You need to play that matchup really fast. Against most decks, you need to play the matchup really fast into Dromai, but I don't think, again, it's an unbeatable matchup. If they get your Nullrun Boots or Crown of Seeds with Tumultai, that's not the end of the world. You don't really care so much about Crown of Seeds in that specific matchup. It makes the shield a bit worse, but that's fine. But we also run the Tome of Harvest to help us kick off the card from Arsenal, and that's pretty relevant a lot of times. Tome of Harvest, great card. Okay, so let's move on into the Lexi. Okay, Lexi right now again is a bit tricky. The initial approach most likely is that you low-key want to fatigue her because she just doesn't have the tools to leak enough damage. Though the great thing with Guardians is that if you are you can pivot into the aggressive style if you feel like they do not have the ways to disrupt you enough. And you have some cards that actually devastate their turns, and that's pretty huge. These cards are Command and Conquer and Spinal Crush. Command and Conquer, Spinal Crush are turns that just give a hard stop to them, and Debilitate again really shines in the matchup. Actually, against the Lexi, in my match with George Melisakis that you can see again down below in the finals, I added the 2 copies of Stone's Response and cutted the 2 copies of Crash the Week because actually Stone's Response helps a lot with stopping the breaking points of the arrows, and arrows a lot of times with any amplifier can pretty much easily reach 7. So 7 is a great number when facing off against Lexi because you can actually prevent these weird numbers without having to overcommit a lot. So both of the approaches are fine. If you be aggressive, you can actually kill them because they do not like to block, and if you get enough disruptive effects, you can just devastate them. If you go down the more defensive route, if you do not get screwed over your 2 blocks, I think it's pretty easy to, again, make them run out of arrows. So, in theory, it's an easy matchup, but Lexi is one of the, at the moment, I think, most explosive decks. It's not as consistent as, let's say, Fi or Briar, but they can, with 2 cards in Arsenal, you have no big attack, they just, you blocked their turn, they just throw 1 arrow and go, I have a card in Arsenal face up and I put a second card in Arsenal, and you have no threat. That's something that can actually happen, and you just, I don't know, pitch 2 blues, attack with Glacial Footsteps and Arsenal your last card, and they just take 8. It's pretty easy for them with 6 cards in hand and Amulet of Ice on board and 3 of a kind to leak you enormous amounts of damage. So it's not unthinkable to lose that matchup. Okay, that's pretty much enough with Lexi. We should move on to Azalea. Okay, Azalea, even though it might sound silly, it's the same but a bit worse. The problem with Azalea is that Death Dealer actually plays great into your game plan, which your game plan is you want to block with either 1 or 2 cards and attack with the other and get more value out of your cards. And Death Dealer actually draws them a card every single turn. So what you actually need is you hope for Azalea to miss a turn, which is not too hard to happen. It's not out of the question to happen, but you really need to protect your rampart of the Ram's Head because their win condition is actually to hit you with a drill shot. And we know, I mean, the more experienced Azalea players know that it's pretty easy for you to throw 4 or 5 drill shots, red dominated drill shots during the course of the game. So you actually really need to pay really close attention to that. If it's a bit more aggressive Azalea, that's a bit fine, but you actually really need them to miss a turn at some point, and the problem is that your cards, your CNC and stuff like that are not as strong as it's versus Lexi. So the matchup is pretty hard, but Azalea is just not consistent enough, and you have the tools to walk around, dominate. You can lose, but you also have many ways to prevent the dominate effects. If you are never get hit by a drill shot, I don't think you can lose the game if you are never hit by a drill shot. So that's why we love the Stone's Responses, we want to play around Dominate, we love having defense reactions in Arsenal, and we love the Crown of Siege Rampart, Earth React, and we effectively block any 7 arrow attack without any setup. So again, I don't think Azalea should be too big of a deal. And Arakni, alright. Arakni, I think we are his doom. I think we are Arakni's doom, to be honest. It's probably for him one of the worst matchups because of how well our deck is equipped to play in the fatigue and because we have so many reactions. You don't really care about the Crash the Week, you just want some big attacks, and I don't think you should have too much big of a problem because at the moment the Arakni playstyles that exist do not have a way to deal with your defensive cards to deal with your defensive playstyles. They almost always need to make their approach first. They need to break the boots, or they need to give +3 with a reaction, and after that you can react with the shield, you can react with... You have many ways of screwing them over. The ice react, so I think it's if you play the game pretty safe, it's pretty consistent to win them if they have a more aggressive approach. If they have a more defensive approach, you can pretty much drag the game out, and even if they run 70 card deck with 3 remembrances, there is no way they can fatigue you, because you have a lot of cards that actually trade up so much, and the 0/4/4 is actually neutral blocked. So they need to attack you with daggers 40 times in order to kill you, which is not easy to do. Okay, that's it with Arakni, and let's go back to the boogeyman, to the guy I wanted to talk about since the beginning. Thanks for staying up to now, and let's talk about Fi. Okay, 90% of the cards in this list are with the Fi matchup in mind. What I mean with that is that the game plan and the game state that you are aiming for, almost all the cards in the deck fit that game plan. You're running Stalagmite, it's actually a pretty important piece of equipment there, and you just run the Crush the Weeks, and you just want to get the game to a state where Fi needs to block the hammer. The second the game gets to that state where they need to start blocking your hammer, you won. It almost doesn't matter how much life you have left. It almost doesn't matter how many cards they have in their deck. There are two problems: if there is a time, if you have problem with time, or if you are dead, if they just block one and kill you. If that doesn't happen, there is no way for them to come back from the game state of you attack with hammer every single turn and they need to block the hammer. Alright, so how to get there though? With Fi, you want to calculate and just count out to get better value out of every single hand you get every turn. That might sound a bit silly, but what I mean is that your card, if you play a red attack and block with everything else for every single turn, your cards generate way more value. And that's the thing that Crush the Week. They need to block Crush the Week with either 2 cards or a defense reaction. Defense reaction is the worst case scenario, 2 cards is what you love to see. Or they miss their turn. If Fi blocks with 2 cards, they cannot threaten more than 7 points of damage in their turn. And that's really easy to calculate your next turn after that, because you play Crush the Week. They block with 2 cards, let's get the good scenario. And after that, it's pretty easy for you to calculate, okay, I do have a Spinal Crush, so I want to block and just play the Spinal Crush. Or I do have some ice cards and a weaker attack, I just have a Command and Conquer, so I'm just going to ice react and strip them of their arsenal and just play, an Endless Winter. It's pretty easy for you to think of what their turn will look like if they only have 3 cards in hand. And that's actually the best, how you win this matchup. It's way easier to use the Stalagmite, it's way easier to do a lot of things. So Polar Blast actually becomes relevant, because most of the time what will happen also is that the 5 player with, let's say, 2 cards in hand, after they block 2 cards, might just, attack with 3 or 4 or play 0/4 or something and arsenal the last card. And it's really easy after that point to weave how you are going to have the most value turn. And that's why Debilitate is great, that's why Spinal Crush is great, that's why all of these cards are super great. The most important thing to remember is that if you do have the option, do not allow them to destroy their mask to get more than 6 points of value. That's probably the trickiest part. If you can use equipment to prevent them from using the mask, if they attack for 7 because they either have an Art of War or they have a Spreading Flames, you need to do that. You don't want them to break off the circle of value and actually you get behind. They have a huge piece of equipment of value being the mask. It's a huge piece of value. You don't want to give them too much of that. You don't want them to allow them to get a super big turn out of the mask. So that's actually where you need to use your equipment. Also, Stalagmite is great, but keep in mind that they run Belittle and stuff. So try to use Stalagmite when you see them pitching red and stuff like that. And also keep in mind with Ice React that they can actually use at instant speed most of the time the Fernans. So it's a lot of times a great bait that, you know, they pitch a blue, attack with 1/4/4, and then attack with sword, and then you block, and try to go Ice React. If you do that, they can actually pitch a red into the Fernans and attack you with the Phoenix Flame as well after that. So you should really keep that in mind. It's a bit tricky. So I don't think this Oldhim list is favored against Fi in general. I do think though that the Fis that are playable right now, because you have such a decisive game plan against them and you know almost exactly what they want to do every single turn, there are no surprises, you are actually favored against that particular deck. So that's my closing thoughts with Oldhim. So I really hope you guys enjoy that. Thanks for staying up to here. So I will have again on below, I will have the video versus Lexi on the finals. I have my talk about the deck with Hamish, and I will also have my list with the sideboard guide regarding when you want to play first and when you want to play second, linked into the deck list. So thanks for staying up here and see you around.